Jail can make some inmates more likely to commit crimes once they get out, but that partly depends on what they're doing when they're inside. Many experts say there's strong evidence that a range of prison education programs help reduce recidivism and improve a prisoner's chances of thriving once released. Last week, ahead of a City Hall hearing on in-prison education reform, formerly incarcerated New Yorkers held a rally joined by criminal justice reform advocates.
Well, their cause, restoring higher education funding and grant eligibility for incarcerated students. To tell us what transpired at the rally and at the hearing, we want to welcome two guests from the College and Community Fellowship, part of the Inside Out Coalition. Mel Gagarin is the Senior Associate of Public Affairs. Welcome, Mel.
Thank you.
And Wesley Keynes is the Reentry Coordinator and Specialist at Brooklyn Defender Services. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Wasn't in-prison college education available 20 years ago? What happened that it was taken away from prisoners?
Sure.
Mel, you want to start?
Yep, I'll start. So yes, the in-prison college education was available over 2 decades ago. Essentially, what we ended up having is it fell victim to this tough on crime era where a bunch of policies were put into place that actually ended up having a detrimental effect in terms of reducing recidivism, increasing public safety, and the lot. And so, unfortunately, in 1994, when legislation was passed and signed by President Bill Clinton, Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated students was removed. And then here in New York, the year following, George Pataki followed suit and also removed tuition assistance program eligibility for folks who are incarcerated. And so we ended up with a situation where you had hundreds of programs around the country, and it fell down to just a handful that were supported just by private dollars instead.
So how much money is available in these Pell Grants? What's the big fund? Is there a number that waxes and wanes, or is it pretty much set with?
Well, I mean, it's a budgetary issue, which sometimes you have shortfalls in the budget or it's increased. At the end of the day, the most important figure is what it actually took from the budget, which is only less than 0.1% that was being used for in-prison college programs. So it really is a very small figure. And the way that the program works, for folks that are incarcerated, once they're eligible, that money was going to the institutions to provide the programs on the inside, and often the grants were not the maximum that perhaps somebody on the outside would, just because of overhead and so forth. Yeah. Ends up being a smaller dollar amount being used.
So there's opposition to this, at least on the federal level, the main argument being why spend money on prisoners and not kids, for example. What's the response to that, Wesley?
Well, I think that people who make that argument, emotionally it's a legitimate statement. I think factually it's false. The fact of the matter is, because it's a needs-based program, it doesn't impact anyone who is not incarcerated if they qualify. So if they qualify and their children are trying to go to college, they still can. Another point to that is that 95% of the people in New York State who are incarcerated will eventually return to the community. And I think that at Brooklyn Defender Services, we see the front end and the back end of individuals who are undereducated or miseducated. So we see the impact of having a higher education on their ability to re-enter society wholly, to get jobs that make them gainfully employed, which prevents them from committing crimes again in the future. Now, what that does for the person who makes the argument that incarcerated individuals should not receive educational funding is that it makes them safer. It's a public safety issue as well.
So the RAND Corporation did this study where they looked at basically 30 years of numbers on prison intake and populations, and they found that only 40% of prisoners had no real high school education, and about 15% of them in New York State had diplomas from high school. So is this sort of misdirected? Is this the fight that's not really translating into a lot if folks don't even have a high school education, and you're fighting for Pell money for folks who need a GED?
That's what we see at Brooklyn Defender Services. So the vast majority of our clients out of Kings County, 45,000 a year, the vast majority of them are committing crimes or alleged to be committing crimes, which are basically economic crimes.
Yeah.
Economic crimes are driven by the fact of undereducation. Some individuals come through the system who have a high school diploma, but really lack the requisite skills to go into the workplace or to go on to higher education. So I think that your point is a valid one, that we need to look at the front end of education and what does it say in the community that individuals are not being educated properly to begin with.
Right.
But also look at the back end. What happens when miseducated individuals find themselves in the criminal justice system? How do we want them to return to the community?
Right.
If we're speaking of public safety, if we're speaking of making individuals more civic-minded and have an equitable state in our own communities, then education features prominently in that.
So if we're looking at this from like the top down, it seems like people are divided along whether they think prisons are for rehabilitating or punishment. So how do you sort of square those sides? Because there are going to be people who say, yeah, we need to give the money to the kids who need to go to school. But it seems to me like that really is the question about whether we're for punishing people or rehabilitating. What's the function of our prisons here in New York?
Sure. So, you know, the idea behind the correction system was one that was supposed to be rehabilitative, right? You know, the fact of the matter remains that these folks are going to come out. As Wesley said, 95% of the folks that are incarcerated are going to go back to the community. And so the fundamental question that we need to answer is, do we want folks going back as prepared as possible to reintegrate into society, to be contributing members of society, to make sure that they are able to break a cycle of criminality that's, you know, there are many factors that contribute to that. But we know that, you know, access to employment is important, sure. Access to housing is important, sure. But the way that our economy has shifted over the course of the past few years, we're in a situation where if you don't have a college degree, being able to sustain any of those facets becomes increasingly more difficult. So we have to stop sort of this idea of whether it's, oh, is it punishment or rehabilitative, and we have to start looking at it from practical common sense approaches, which is what you know, reinstating these grants would do. You know, we have to remember, once again, we're going back to the way things used to be, not inventing something new. You know, when folks that were incarcerated had access to higher ed in the past, you know, society didn't collapse. Right? This was a net positive.
Were recidivism rates lower when folks did have access to these things 20 years ago?
Absolutely. And the studies have shown it for decades. But those studies were rejected. And let me go back to your question of rehabilitation versus punishment. I don't view those two things as mutually exclusive.
Okay.
Prison doesn't become less punitive because you're offered an opportunity to attain higher education. It really doesn't. So the idea that you would take rehabilitation off the table because you want to have prisons be punitive doesn't make sense. The fact of the matter is, unless we're going to throw away the key for everyone who enters the system and no one is going to get out, we have to look at what the outcomes will be once they return to the communities.
So there was a rally last week and a hearing. Why is there a need to push the local government on this issue if it's a federal government issue as well? I mean, like, why should people get involved locally?
Sure. So I say it's twofold. One, as I mentioned earlier, in '95, New York did lose TAP grants to incarcerated individuals that followed suit. You know, I think we're at a unique time right now where criminal justice reform is sort of at the national floor in terms of the debate, and you have folks from both sides of the aisle that realize that something needs to be done. From our perspective, you know, sort of education, access to higher education is a fundamental human right. It's sort of common sense and the low-hanging fruit. And we believe, and we will continue to push to make sure that things such as the REAL Act that was also introduced in May by Congresswoman Donna Edwards that would repeal the ban directly and do that so legislatively happens. And New York needs to follow suit. And so it's important that we not wait until the federal government act. We have the opportunity, and I think we have to have the willpower locally to push our legislators. I mean, last year, Governor Andrew Cuomo made an effort to fund in-prison college education. And I think had he had more support from folks on the ground, you'd be able to push back some of these sort of age-old arguments that you know we know don't hold true, and that's why I think it's really important that folks on the local level get involved, because at the end of the day, you know, we're all going to be in the same community. We want to make sure that we're able to support everyone in being able to come back.
And I saw some figure that for every $1 that we spend on education, we save $4 to $5 on the back end for recidivism. So folks might be, penny wise and dollar smart if they're arguing about, we don't want to spend $600 or $6,000 for these guys to educate and women to educate them in prison, but it costs 4 times that much to house them and send them back if they get on that loop.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, I think, again, going back to this unique moment in time that we're dealing with today, where many in the community are starting to question where they're situated, who are worthy for services, who are worthy to have government and society offer opportunities, legitimate opportunities. And I think this is a prime example of that, because if the dollars and cents of it clearly indicates, and if the studies and the data shows that higher education reduces recidivism and reduces criminal involvement and make for a more civic-minded citizen, what would be ultimately what's gained by not affording
that
this
being
opportunity?
said, college isn't the answer for everybody
Absolutely
on
not.
the outside living their
Absolutely.
lives freely. So what other alternatives are there if it doesn't come back fully, number one, and if people elect not to? Is there another program or something that you would champion that maybe gives like a vocational education that would make you an electrician, a plumber, anything of service coming out of the correctional system?
Well, I'm not going to pit higher education against vocational education or any other programmatic opportunities that's afforded to incarcerated people. I think that all of them play a part in rehabilitation and legitimate opportunity. I think that there's something to be gained from having at least some exposure to higher education in the way that you think, in the way that you orient yourself in the community, and in how you see yourself as part of our society.
Well, thank you both very much for being here. We very much appreciate it.